and welcome to this talk, which is titled In Support of the Commandants, Subaltern Officers of the Moreton Bay District. Now, I'm currently one of the visiting fellows engaged with the Griffith University's Harry Gentle Resource Centre, as just mentioned, compiling biographical information on the British military personnel posted at Moreton Bay in the first half of the 19th century. I intend to discuss in this presentation, time permitting, a particular subaltern's, a randomly selected subaltern's biography as an example of the work I do, depending upon the time we have here. And after which there'll be about 20 minutes allocated for a Q&A session afterwards, so store them up and I'll do my best to answer your questions at the end of this. Little remains today of the legacy from Moreton Bay's convict past, apart from some structures such as the commissariat stores, the old windmill, some archaeological remains at Redcliffe and Dunwich, as well as numerous place names. If we confine ourselves just to Queensland's southeast corner, we have the examples of Hilliard's Creek, named after George Hilliard of the 28th. Mount Gravatt, again of the 28th, George Gravatt. And Logan Creek, Logan River, after Patrick Logan. Mount Cotton, Major Sydney John Cotton. Clooney's Flats at the mouth of the Brisbane River, after James Clooney. Gorman's Gap, Lockyer Creek, after Major Edmund Lockyer. My favourite, which is Norman Creek, which is the only one named after an NCO as far as I know, Sergeant John Norman of the 40th Regiment. Ovens Head, named after Lieutenant John Ovens of the 57th, not to be confused with his uncle, Major John Ovens, also of the 57th Regiment, who was also an engineer. And even Coochie-Mudlow Island was once known as Innes Island, named after Lieutenant Joseph Long Innes of the 39th. Likewise, when we think of the military officers posted to Brisbane town during its convict period 1824 to 1841, names such as Henry Miller, Patrick Logan, James Clooney, Foster Fynes, Sydney Cotton, Owen Gorman, all spring to mind. Yet these commandants could not have fulfilled their duties without the support of the staff of subaltern officers. During the commandancies of both Logan and Clooney from 1826 to 1835, it was usual for the most recently arrived subaltern at Brisbane town to hold the post of either superintendent of works or assistant engineer, although, as pointed out elsewhere, none of these officers would have possessed the necessary skills or knowledge required for these roles, and hence were quite dependent upon the overseers for guidance. This practice appears to have begun with Lieutenant John Ovens before he was transferred as the role of assistant engineer to Lieutenant Joseph Innes, and then to Lieutenant Thomas Bainbrig, George Edwards, William Harvey, and finally Lieutenant John Nagle. And it's interesting to note that Clooney strongly opposed the appointment of Nagle to any position. I don't know what his particular problem was, but for the most part, their duties would have been mundane during the convict period at least, and this in turn led to boredom. Sorry, I got a sore throat as well. Assistant Surgeon Dr. Fitzgerald Murray described the military officers he encountered at Brisbane town as, quote, desperate grog drinkers and cigar smokers, unquote. Although he was prepared to consider Lieutenant George Edwards an exception to this rule. Often we only catch glimpses of these subalterns, such as when Lieutenant Charles Otter of the 4th Regiment went north to rescue Eliza Fraser, or Lieutenant Frederick Brown Russell of the 28th searched for 2 sailors from the wreck of the Duke of York in 1837, only to learn later that they'd both been killed by the Ewan Mundy tribe. Even Lieutenant George Hilliard of the 28th received considerable praise and presentations of silver cups when he led a mounted police detachment directly after his posting to Moreton Bay and was responsible for the capture of notorious bushrangers after a shootout. Part of this neglect of the Moreton Bay subalterns was due to the fact that many were posted to Moreton Bay only briefly, such as Thomas Kirkley of the 39th Regiment, who was present here for only 2 months. These brief postings stand in contrast to the Commandants themselves, whose tenure was much longer and usually saw several subalterns pass under their command. Captain Logan might have had the longest stay, but this was cut short by his death after only 4 years, 7 months, and hence he was eclipsed by Captain Clooney, whose posting at Moreton Bay was the longest at 4 years, 8 months. Of course, the number of subalterns under a commandant's command was determined by the number of soldiers forming the detachment, and the size of the detachment was in turn determined by the number of convicts they were required to keep under guard. The usual ratio of convicts to soldiers across was roughly maintained to the ratio of 10 to 1, 10 convicts to 1 soldier. Likewise, that is when assisted by a capable NCO, took charge of approximately a dozen soldiers, while the lieutenant commanded about 30 and a captain around a company of 100. Now, let's see if this works. As mentioned above, I'll be referring to these officers as subalterns rather than junior officers, because of the 40 officers who served at Moreton Bay during 1824 to 1850, only 7 were below the age of 21, while the average age for a subaltern was 36.5 years. When taken together, these junior officers were seldom junior in age and were, although there were some discrepancies as well, such as the oldest subaltern being Lieutenant William Bell of the Royal New South Wales Veterans Corps, was aged 55 when he arrived at Moreton Bay, while the youngest, Lieutenant Patrick Johnson of the 99th, had just turned 18. Both men held the same rank, even though separated by an age gap of 37 years. All this tends to demonstrate how slow promotion could be in a peacetime army when one lacked the financial means to purchase one's advancement. This leads us into the subject of the purchase system of attaining rank. Now, today we're used to the idea of military officers undergoing years of education and grueling training to obtain their first commission. But back in the period between Waterloo and the Crimean War, which is variously called the Long Sleep or the Great Peace by certain British military historians, the criteria for promotion in the army was largely by means of the purchase system. So it should be noted that the purchase system was peculiar to the army alone, as the other branches of the forces relied upon much more rigorous methods, the so-called scientific corps, that is the artillery and the engineers, required intelligent and educated men due to the nature of their service, and both needed extensive study and examination. Likewise, the Navy had a long-established tradition of lengthy apprenticeships, beginning when one was quite a young lad, and involved the study of very demanding navigational mathematics. The most common way of becoming an ensign, that was the lowest commission rank in the British Army at the time, was simply to purchase your commission. No training, no experience, no education was at all necessary. All that mattered was whether you had the funding, had attended the right schools, and your parents had made the right social connections. It is therefore no surprise that officers tend to come largely from the higher strata of society. The landed gentry, the aristocracy, or the aspiring middle classes, as the cost of the ensigncy itself, as well as the continuing expenses of uniforms, weapons, accoutrement, mess bills, regimental charities, and countless other incidentals, excluded any but the wealthier strata of society. This did not mean that those from aristocratic families always purchased their promotions, any more than those of humble origins were excluded from holding a commission. I know this is not a subaltern. It's Sidney Cotton as a commandant, but he serves a good example. Sidney Cotton and Peter Bishop. Sidney Cotton, as you know, was commandant and served in the 28th Regiment. Well, Peter Bishop relieved Henry Miller at Redcliffe. Now, both these men came from rather privileged backgrounds, with Cotton's own particular lineage reading like a page from Burke's Peerage, with his cousin, Sir Stapleton Cotton, sometimes referred to as Wellington's right arm, was raised in the peerage to Baron Combermere in 1814. And Sidney Cotton was appointed his aide-de-camp when he was serving in India in the 1820s. Likewise, Peter Bishop, born at Bishopscourt, Ireland, into the Anglo-Irish aristocracy and married to Julia Talbot, sister to the Earl of Shrewsbury. Now, the point of comparison here with both Cotton and Bishop is that both came from well-connected and rather well-off families, yet neither man ever used the purchase system to obtain a promotion. By contrast, there were officers like Owen Gorman, who began his career as a private in the 58th Regiment and must have possessed the acumen to rise through the non-commissioned ranks to Sergeant Major and then to Quartermaster. The position of Quartermaster at the time could be held by either a senior non-commissioned officer or a junior subaltern, and it appears Gorman used this position to gain his ensigncy. By seniority, that is by 1830, without the purchase system, at the rather advanced age of 31 for an ensign. While obtaining an ensigncy imposed an initial financial burden on the officer or his family, it was possible, if one were patient, to obtain further promotions simply by the process of seniority, as with each promotion, every officer within the regiment moved one step higher up the ladder. The most senior lieutenant became a captain, while the second most senior lieutenant now became the most senior lieutenant, in line for promotion to captain. That is, once a vacancy arose. Of course, it was entirely possible that once a captaincy became vacant, a lieutenant with the finances could purchase this captaincy over the head of the most senior lieutenant. And as one can imagine, this jumping of the queue method of advancement was not popular with those who had been passed over. Alternatively, one could obtain promotion by means of volunteering to serve in a regiment destined for a rather unpopular destination, such as the West Indies, which, due to the climate, was often referred to as the graveyard of the British soldier. Likewise, convict escort duty to the Australian colonies was equally seen as rather onerous, and was consequently a rapid means of promotion, since any officer who had the means of getting out of a regiment bound for Australia took that means to get out, and there were various dodges they could do to get out of the regiment. And this left vacancies to be filled by officers who didn't have much money to purchase a full ensigncy. They could only afford a cheaper ensigncy. So likewise, although against regulations, the asking prices for an ensigncy or a lieutenancy went down in price so as to attract potential officers who lacked the financial backing to afford a commission in any other regiment. This would seem to have been the path taken by Lieutenant John Nagle, who opted to serve in the unpopular East Indies. Although, as Nagle had been born at Jafra Patram on the island of Ceylon, the climate may not have been much affecting him as much as any other officer from Britain. So far, we've focused on subalterns present during Moreton Bay's Convict Period. And I'd now like to examine the role of the subaltern officer during the beginning of the free settlement phase. It had been anticipated by both the colonial and war officers in Britain that with the end of transportation and a move towards free settlement, the military would essentially have no role, and these troops could then be returned to Britain or to a colony that had a greater need for them. The rationale for this became increasingly apparent as Britain's post-Waterloo empire grew while the size of her army remained much the same. By the 1830s, there were more redcoats posted overseas guarding British possessions than were actually stationed in Britain itself. As the Duke of Wellington observed, this imbalance meant that in the event of a major European war, Britain would have to rely on its navy for defending the home isles alone. By the 1840s, the Colonial Secretary Earl Grey introduced some reforms to alleviate this demand upon Britain's army by dividing the colonies into three broad categories. Some colonies were strictly military in nature, such as Gibraltar. Others, such as India and South Africa, still needed a strong military presence due to ongoing conflicts. The last category included colonies that were either self-governing or approaching their status, such as Canada and the Australian colonies, which were intended to provide for their own defence. While this seemed reasonable that these colonies with self-governance should also look to their own defence, these colonies objected strongly to bearing the cost of protecting assets over which Britain held a trade monopoly. Moreover, in the event of a major European war, these same colonies would be vulnerable to foreign attack as a result of Britain's foreign policies over which they had no control. Eventually, a temporary compromise was reached between Britain and her semi-independent colonies, which saw the continuation of redcoats posted to these colonies until such time as they could maintain their own viable volunteer defence forces. However, a combination of intercolonial rivalry, hostilities breaking out in New Zealand, all necessitated the retention of British soldiers in the Australasian colonies far longer than was expected. So at Moreton Bay, this was especially the case, as the frontier conflict with Aborigines in the early 1840s was seen as comparable to the Maori Uprising in New Zealand. Roderick Flanagan, in his Aborigines of Australia, published in 1888, referred to this period in the 1840s as the Great Rising of 1842 to 1844, and described it as, quote, simultaneous aggressive movement of the Aborigines throughout the entire colony and along its boundaries, which commenced in 1842 and continued for more than 2 years. The warfare which the blacks waged upon the stations was universal, implacable, and incessant, unquote. While the Moreton Bay penal station had been relatively isolated due to the 50-mile exclusion zone surrounding it, occasionally clashes with Aborigines had occurred as early as Logan's time, when the settlers' crops were raided. The scale of these skirmishes was relatively insignificant, as the military's attention was focused more inwards, directed at the convict population. But with the winding down of the Moreton Bay penal station, the role of the military with regard to local Aborigines was to change dramatically with the coming of free settlement. As the penal settlement at Moreton Bay wound down, in preparation for becoming a free settlement, the military detachments sent to this posting correspondingly decreased in size over time, a trend which is apparent by glancing at the troop strength chart. Now, you can see, I wonder if I can use this thing. I might have to stand for this, sorry. Oh, now, can you still hear me? Yes, great. Now, as can be seen here from this chart, bingo, there's two notable humps you can see, if I can find here. Yeah, two distinct humps. Now, the first hump here, oh, blast. Okay. There we go. Mustn't touch that button. Now, the first hump here relates to the convict period. So, just to explain, what we have here is the coming of the 40th Regiment and its replacement by the 57th, then the 17th, and we have here the decline, the winding down of the settlement until the early 1840s, but there's this massive jump here. Now, you'd think that the soldier strength would just wind down to about zero. This second hump here requires some explanation, as we'll find out later. It was necessary to reinforce the military at Moreton Bay in the 1840s due to this Aboriginal uprising. Just before I continue, you'll notice that there's occasionally these spikes. Would anyone like to guess what they are? It's quite interesting. What they represent is the transitional period when you have one regiment coming in to replace the regiment that's going out. And so for a brief period, you've got 2 detachments here, and that's what's causing these spikes. But as you can see, they're only briefly lived, which is quite what you'd expect. As can be seen, the 2 distinct hums, with the first describing the rise and decline of free settlement, while the second lesser hump, describing which began in 1843, describes the rush to reinforce the military at Moreton Bay due to the outbreak of conflict, Aboriginal conflict on the frontier. All this, you'll notice, was triggered by the Kilcoy Station massacre, where at the Kilcoy Station, the manager left out poisoned flour with arsenic in it, and this caused not only many Aboriginal deaths, but triggered a spate of Aboriginal retribution. Moreover, it was a unifying factor in many of these Aboriginal clans that normally perhaps would not have merged together for a common cause, but the massacre at Kilcoy certainly provided that impetus for them to unite against the white intruders. So the outbreak of the Indigenous resistance commenced in 1842, reaching its peak over the following 2 years. And it caught the military entirely by surprise. There can be little doubt that without the assistance of parties of well-armed mounted squatters and the rapid arrival of reinforcements from Sydney, these rather insignificant Brisbane detachments, no more than 20 men, would have been entirely ineffective for what was required of them. So when Owen Gorman's force of barely 20 soldiers of the 80th Regiment was replaced in May 1842 by a detachment of about 20 men, much the same size, it's a detachment from the 99th Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant John James Armstrong, who was a 20-year-old Irish subaltern who had recently received his lieutenancy only the month before. Armstrong reported before leaving Moreton Bay in a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, "The blacks still continued troublesome about the Darling Downs, making it very unsafe travelling unless in company and well armed," unquote. He was fortunate to have left the district before the frontier war reached its crescendo in 1843 under his successor, Lieutenant Patrick Johnston. Johnston, as we noted earlier, was the youngest subaltern to have served at Moreton Bay, although, unlike Armstrong, he had 15 months more seniority as a lieutenant. Not that that greatly mattered. But he would go on to gain much combat experience, as well as quite a few wounds, while serving in New Zealand. These are just the subalterns and the arrival and departure dates and the duration of their posting. Again, if you want copies of this, they could be arranged for you. Now, the period beginning Johnston's arrival at Moreton Bay in late 1842 through to late 1846, and the end of Lieutenant Seymour's command. I'm talking about Lieutenant William Hobart Seymour, not David Thomas Seymour, different fellow. Command saw the unprecedented slaughter of Aborigines, such that bones were still being recovered from the site of Withcott Helidon as late as the 1920s. Even Lieutenant George de Winton, writing from Brisbane the following year in 1847, noted of Johnston's reign that, quote, he imparted some severe lessons to the Aborigines, unquote. Likewise, J.J. Knight, who wrote within living memory of these events, asserted, quote, "This period of military supervision was one of terrible slaughter. Scores upon scores of Aborigines falling victims to the white man's gun. One of the men who assisted in putting away many of these unfortunate blacks out of existence told the writer several incidents which, if repeated here today, would scarcely be regarded as pleasant reading, nor yet rebound to the credit of persons now living," unquote. This embarrassed silence by white participants was not mere Victorian sentimentality, but a means of escaping prosecution. In a letter to the Maitland Mercury, one correspondent and participant declared, quote, "We were more successful in falling in with the blacks the second time, but I do not wish to say too much on that subject," unquote. There can be little doubt that this Aboriginal uprising was a concerted effort across southeast Queensland and west across the Downs. Isolated stations were besieged, drays were ambushed, station hands fortified their homesteads with gun slots and an arsenal of muskets. As many of these major squatters were also commissioned magistrates, they had the authority to call upon the military to act in aid of the civil authorities to restore order. Their guide in using this power was outlined for these magistrates in John Plunkett's The Australian Magistrate, which was given to every newly appointed Justice of the Peace in New South Wales, and explained that not only could civilians be deputised to form an armed force, but the military could also be commandeered to provide assistance to restore order. While this role would normally be filled by a frontier police force, none as yet existed beyond the 3 or 4 few drunken and insubordinate border police troopers available to Commissioner of Crown Lands Stephen Simpson. Consequently, these magistrates/squatters could lay claim to vast tracts of land, and if any Aboriginal resistance was encountered, they could act within the letter of the law in calling out a locally raised posse comitatus and the military to consolidate their land holdings, all under the guise of restoring order. After a particularly vicious clash in September 1843 near the foot of the Downs, known today as the Battle of One Tree Hill, Lieutenant Johnston established a military post, often incorrectly called Fort Helidon, where a dozen redcoats, that is, half his actual force, were posted with orders to escort drays bound for the Downs. Now, as we can remember from the troop strength graph, this met with a rapid reinforcement, that second hump I showed you, from Sydney. The significance of this reinforcement is very hard to overstate, as elsewhere in the Australian colonies, troops were being withdrawn and sent across the Tasman to meet the Maori crisis in New Zealand. Hence, that the commander of British forces in the Australian colonies, Major General Edward Wynyard, could find the necessary troops to double Moreton Bay's detachment size at a time when every spare soldier was needed in New Zealand, says much about how the Aboriginal uprising at Moreton Bay was seen. This frontier conflict continued after Johnston's departure and continued with a force numbering over 50 soldiers, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Lee of the 99th Regiment, until he too was replaced in mid-1844 by detachments drawn from the 58th Regiment, commanded by Captain William Grant, who had a spectacular demise in New Zealand, and Lieutenant Francis Master, as well as Lieutenant Edward Barker and Isaac Cooper of the 58th, who later went to serve in New Zealand. In 1846, this conflict was beginning to abate, and by the time of William Seymour's posting that year, he recommended that Fort Helidon be closed down due to the difficulty of keeping it supplied and the decline of frontier violence. By the time of Seymour's successors, Lieutenant Charles Blamire, who was posted to Moreton Bay from September 1846 to May 1847, and George de Winton from July 1847 to May 1848. There we go. Moreton Bay, from 1848, ceased to be a military post. By 1848, and the withdrawal of Lieutenant William Seymour's Brisbane detachment of the 99th Regiment, the military authorities felt that there was little justification for retaining a military post at Brisbane. This removal of redcoats from Brisbane left the settlement unprotected for the first time since its founding, and many local residents petitioned for the restoration of a military force. Quote, "May it please Your Excellency, the undersigned inhabitants of the town of Brisbane, Moreton Bay, beg respectfully to express to Your Excellency their regret at the entire withdrawal of the military detachment that has hitherto served in the district, and to express their apprehensions of the result. They would suggest to Your Excellency several circumstances which appear to them to give the inhabitants of this settlement a strong claim to protection of a military force. First and foremost, the fact of their being surrounded by a numerous Aboriginal population who, though the latter have been little troublesome hitherto in the neighbourhood of the town, cannot but feel their comparative strength now that the force, of which they had stood in great awe, is now removed." Unquote. As a consequence, the Commander-in-Chief of Troops in the Australian colonies, Major General Edward Wynyard, dispatched a small detachment of 34 soldiers from the 11th Regiment, commanded by 22-year-old Ensign George Cameron. Cameron's role as commanding officer of the Brisbane detachment was remarkable for two reasons. The first being that, as an ensign, he was the lowest ranking subaltern to ever hold a command at Moreton Bay. And the second was that Cameron was the first commanding officer at Moreton Bay to not also hold a dual commission as Justice of the Peace. As Lieutenant George de Winton noted in his memoirs, Soldiering 50 Years Ago, quote, "The officer in command was always nominated as a magistrate," unquote. This point may not have mattered but for the incident involving Aborigines in late 1849, when Cameron's detachment mistakenly fired into a group of Aborigines conducting a nighttime corroboree. Had Cameron also been a magistrate, he may have known how best to act in a circumstance, thus enabling him to act independently. As it was, the only magistrate available, Dr. David Beller, flatly refused to become involved. This incident, which became known as the affray at York's Hollow, and afterwards it became there was a trial, a show trial really, to punish some soldiers believed to have fired without authorisation. The entire detachment was removed from Brisbane in July 1850 under a cloud of ignominy. As a consequence, the Moreton Bay district was now, for the first time since 1824, devoid of any military force for the following decade, until Governor Bowen's arrival and his insistence for more imperial troops in the form of the 12th Regiment detachment from 1860 to 66, followed by a full company of the 50th Regiment from 1866 until its withdrawal in 1869. These would be the last British troops posted to Brisbane until the locally raised volunteer force was established with mixed success. In conclusion, it can be seen that the roles of the subaltern officers vary greatly in accordance with whether their service was during the convict or free settlement period at Moreton Bay's early history. Subalterns serving during the convict period tended to have briefer postings and were always subordinate and under the guidance of a commandant, whereas during the early free settlement period, these subalterns invariably acted independently upon their own judgment with no as a consequence, mistakes were made. This was particularly the case during the settlement's frontier war, for which none of the subalterns were in the least bit trained for this type of guerrilla conflict. Finally, throughout this early free settlement phase, the size of the detachments were such that they could not hope to provide any more than psychological reassurance to settlers. Okay, thank you very much.